All right, so just so you guys know, we are recording, just so I have that disclaimer up again, now that it's actually recording. So first and foremost, welcome to Trans 101 for the SCA. This is basically your primer on, general interactions, a lot of history. There's a little bit of discussion about the ethics of research. As a disclaimer, this class is intended to provide a baseline of knowledge for the general public and or allies. Any person who is considering gender transition should speak to their medical and or mental health care team for further information. So before we get too much further, I'm Thane Sampson Muscovich. I'm better known as Sammy in the SCA. I'm one of the two barons of the barony of Carrigbon. Yeah, I'm one of the two barons of the barony of Carrigbon in the Middle Kingdom. So I'm on Central Time Zone, and I know that's kind of weird for some people because we do the whole daylight savings time back and forth. So I know there's some discrepancy with the timing and everything. But yeah. So getting started with the basics. So defining sex and gender. First, you've got sex. Sex is going to be your biological assignment at birth. Typically, sex at birth is defined as one of three ways. It's going to be you have males who typically, and bear in mind when I say this is all like the biological assignment at birth based on markers, various markers that the individual might have. A male is going to be somebody who produces sperm, and they're going to also develop at puberty facial and body hair secondary sex characteristics. Females are people who are typically going to produce eggs, have ovaries. Males, of course, have penis, typically, as defined at birth. Females produce eggs, have ovaries. They develop breast tissue as secondary sex characteristics at puberty. And then you have individuals who are born as intersex. Those individuals may possess characteristics of both or neither easily identifiable at birth. They're often going to be assigned a gender role based on genital representation at birth, and then they may undergo genital reconstruction surgery shortly after birth at the will of the parents for representation of male or female. Now, it is important to note that a lot of the thoughts surrounding that have changed in the last decade or so. So there's been a really strong push for infants to not have that surgery. And basically, the parents a lot, especially in the last decade, and as we have developed our knowledge of sex, gender, and everything in between, to let that individual develop their sense of identity and autonomy naturally. That's one of the reasons why you'll see that the gender reveal parties are not as popular these days, depending on where your lexicon is and where your cultural base is. So one of the other components of that is gender. So gender is going to be your traditional social construct based on perception. So you have the stereotypical gender binary. Males are typically identified as being strong, brave, muscular, very knightly, very chivalrous, sometimes very machismo, like very, all of these very strong characteristics where it's, rah, 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 rah. And then on the other component of the binary, which again, bear in mind this is reinforced by this, society, females are typically framed as being very docile, quiet, doe-like, very submissive, I'm going to be very demure, virginal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have that, the quote, battle of the sexes, as it were, strong versus not as much, or strong versus weak and whatnot. Well, then you've got, especially over the last couple of decades, the concept of gender identity. And then that's going to range on a spectrum between masculine to feminine and really anywhere in between or not at all. And within that, within that spectrum, you've got individuals who identify as gender fluid. So that person's day-to-day identity is going to fluctuate between male, female, or anywhere in between. And then you have folks who are non-binary. So that person's day-to-day identity includes aspects of both or neither masculine and feminine traits or roles. And it really depends on how that person identifies and how they choose to identify. Both of those are. So then where does that leave transgender in all of this? So simply stated, somebody who identifies as transgender and understand, yeah, and also too, these are very basic definitions. There are it's a lot more complicated once you actually start breaking things down and start looking within that spectrum. But in terms of the basic definition for transgender, it's going to be someone whose gender identity and their physical body are out of sync. For example, a person can identify as masculine while having secondary sex characteristics of a female. Hi, that would be me. I use myself as an example because I have no problem with it. I am out in all aspects of my life. Like it does not have a bearing on my personal security. So that is my personal choice to out myself during the class. Plus, I'm also the friendly face that people can get to see and ask questions of, and I have no problem with it. Please note that transitioning is an individual experience that is unique to that person. Not everyone who identifies as transgender or gender nonconforming, which is a spectrum, keep in mind, is able to or wishes to access appropriate clinical care. It ultimately depends on what is safe for you and what is safe for that individual more specifically. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, including your your family social dynamics, your immediate society dynamics, and just all of these other things. So that's kind of where we're left with that. So one of the things that defines our experience in the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism, is interactions. So one of the biggest things that we basically have as an indicator for how we interact with someone is their appearance. Trans and gender nonconforming individuals may or may not wear clothing in alignment with their gender identity. They're going to be the same people that you know, love, and respect prior to their transition. Nothing is changing. The only thing that's changing is that person is becoming more confident. They're going to eventually become more confident with themselves and more self-realizing, perhaps. But they're the exact same person. But they're the exact same person that you know, love, and all of that. Nothing's really changing except for the outer shell. Especially if someone is newly out, it is often a huge display of trust for that person to present their authentic self in an event. Like I said, you're going to treat them no differently as they are no different. They're going to be that same person that you know and you like. Maybe you go shoot archery with them, or maybe you do throwing weapons with them, or maybe there's somebody that you're on the rattan or the rapier list, or rattan or fencing list, because I'm trying to adjust language constantly because it changes and evolves. Maybe there's somebody you practice with on a regular basis and they've decided to essentially come out in an event. It's a thing. The SCA obviously is, as I'm sure you all have experienced, it's an incredibly open and accepting place. A lot of our members seek knowledge, so we ask questions. We often are open to change, and we're extremely courteous. We try to respect each other. So, but there's some stuff that even in that pursuit of knowledge, though, there are some things that we can't ask. You cannot ask if people have had the surgery or similar questions. You can't ask them, transition-related questions. Just in general. This does violate U.S. patient privacy laws, and really, unless you're a healthcare provider, you shouldn't, or rendering first aid, you shouldn't be asking them this question. And it also violates the SCA's non-discrimination policy. So the harassment and bullying policy, this is all covered under that. Don't ask those questions. And there's always the caveat of, if you know the person, have a relationship with them, like interpersonal relationship with them, you may be able to ask them some of those questions privately, but it is, like, again, unless you're rendering first aid or unless you're a medical provider, you should not be asking these questions. So that's my spiel on that. So forms of address. In terms of basic pronouns, bearing in mind that different individuals have different pronouns that they use for themselves, and that's completely okay. But basic pronoun address for masculine he, him, and his. Feminine are typically going to be she, her, and hers. Neutral, they, them, and theirs. And like I said, there are other ones that are varied. It depends on the person and what they use for themselves. The biggest thing, again, going back to that whole concept of courtesy, if you're not sure about somebody's pronouns, ask. Typically, what I personally typically if I'm introducing myself to somebody and I actually realize I failed to do this because again, I'm still, like, even in my own day-to-day language, there's still that learning curve. Typically, how I introduce myself is, "Hi, I'm Thane Sammy of Carrigbon. My pronouns are he, him, and his. How may I address you?" That's one of those things where I just try to be respectful of my fellow person, and I want to give them the agency to define themselves. A lot of trans and gender nonconforming folks would rather you ask them out of respect instead of assuming, because especially now as we're learning and we're developing our concept of language, the rules have changed. So instead of assuming that somebody, even if they're wearing a dress, they might identify as masculine or they may identify as gender neutral. So one of our people that's here mentioned that one of their favorite responses to people who ask them about their genitals, they respond with, "Why do you want to go out with me?" That is typically my thing as well. Frankly, again, unless you're intending... Hi, Ish. Typically, unless you're intending to,
Can I go to the stairs?
Unless they're intending to get down and dirty with me later after the lights go down, or maybe during the day or whatever, it's really none of their business. That's something that is reserved for an intimate partner. Intimate partner. So that's an excellent point on that.
See, Mom?
So if someone tells you their pronouns are different, ultimately you want to try and use the name and pronouns to tell you.
Is it starting to burn out?
Hey, can you mute yourself, please?
It's turning black. That means they're starting to burn out. Okay. And it's burning out.
No, it's not one to mute.
Thank you.
The mute button's not working.
Okay, give me 1 second. I can take care of that then. Okay, so I've got him muted. He's got a really adorable grandson. He really does. But yeah. So I'm gonna get rid of the chat window for right now. So like I was saying, if somebody tells you their pronouns are different, ultimately you want to try and use that name and pronouns that they tell you. Some people, like I mentioned, they may use pronouns that are not listed in that base list. If somebody asks you to use a different set, please try to do so. So mistakes happen. It's a thing of life. Don't make a big deal out of it if you mess up. Calling attention to the error can create a bigger deal than it needs to be. And there's also the potential, depending on where you are in the world, that it has the potential of endangering the trans or gender nonconforming individual. Like there are certain parts of the United States where it absolutely can bear an impact. We obviously hope in our world that it doesn't, but it sometimes does. It's that whole, going back to the whole concept of respecting the individual. Make a point of trying to use using the correct pronouns going forward. And if you're telling a story from times past, you're going to try and use the subject's current gender markers and pronouns. Had a question from one of the individuals. So any suggestions for guidance on honorifics like Lord, Lady, etc. that can be used for folks who identify as gender neutral? So I'm actually going to answer that question in just a moment, because the next section is on court procedures and interactions. So ideally, and I know it kind of conflicts with the whole concept of don't assume, but ultimately you want to try and use the pronouns or form of address that most closely align with the person's gender identity. It's their gender identity, though, not their appearance, because hopefully at that point, like, someone in the room knows the person. I mean, even if it's that person's first SCA event, asking them earlier, hey, hey, this is how I identify. I'd like to be regarded as this person, this, as this. You've kind of established that baseline. You can do that small, just so you have that interaction with that person. So to answer that question directly, though, the SCA College of Heralds approved gender-neutral forms of address on scrolls and in court as of July 2018. So we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of that, which is very, very exciting. I know it's super, super exciting. As a herald myself, both book and court herald, it's very, very exciting. So the two forms of address, and I think there's a third too. I'm just forgetting what it is. The two I remember for sure are armiger and noble. I actually have a barony member who uses noble, and I have a friend who uses armiger as their form of address. And partially just because of the fact that it is a gender neutral term, and they sound really cool, not gonna lie. So as I mentioned earlier, I am from the Middle Kingdom, so a lot of my core knowledge is based out of there. But I get around a bit. I go up to North Shield quite a bit. I go over to Callantyre quite a bit, just because they're geographically close to me. I'm 2 hours away from each border. So I get over to each place, as frequently as I can. But anyway, so I know for sure the Middle Kingdom and a lot of the other kingdoms are really good at providing the populace with the opportunity to have the order of precedence updated. I know North Shield, for example, has got an option now where they can select or they can input what their pronouns are or what their gender identity is. The Mid-Realm is getting to that point. It's something that I've requested from Kingdom, and I know that it's on their list of things that they're working on, and they are, at least in the award recommendations, they've adjusted for that and accounted for that so that you can provide notes on how somebody is addressed if you know that. But yeah, so with the order of precedence, you can have somebody, as an individual who, if it applies to you or whatnot, you can request to have that information updated. Also, updated scrolls. For updated scrolls, if you need one, contact your kingdom's backlog signet or kingdom signet. So I know again, most of my information is based in the Middle Kingdom, so because that's where I live. But at least in the Middle Kingdom, there's a limit of 2 to 3 years for prior for requests in the venue. The other option that individuals have is they can always commission a scribe. I know that every kingdom has got hundreds of scribes, literally. So, and quite a few of them are often willing to assist somebody who wants a scroll update, or they want to commission a new scroll with the correct name. Tracking down the crown is a whole other matter entirely. Some of them, unfortunately, are no longer on this plane. But, I mean, the award has been given, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, like I mentioned too, most of my knowledge is the Middle Kingdom, but many of the society's kingdoms offer similar services to their populace. Your kingdom's precedence clerk and backlog signet can be contacted for further information on that. They will have specific information. It's been a couple years since I've updated it. I will need to reach out to them again, but that's a project for later on the summer while I'm getting ready for, after everyone's lives have kind of restored and we're back to some semblance of normal. So are there any questions on interactions or core procedures before I move on to history? Oh, very cool. Awesome. Thank you, Sophie. The other gender neutral option is gentle, which, thank you. I keep forgetting that one for some reason. I'm going to just go ahead and add that to my notes now so I don't forget it. All right, so there being no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Yeah, so generally speaking too, before I move on to history, if you've got a suggestion for your kingdom order of precedence or whatnot, contact whoever the relevant authority is on that. It might be your website admin, it might be your kingdom web minister, it might be the order of precedence clerk, it might be your signet. Each kingdom's hierarchy is a little bit different. Use your best, use your best judgment there, and kind of go from there. Your local seneschal should be able to direct you in the right direction. That's kind of what their job is. So, or they might be able to bump that up to the next echelon, to the next level of whatever they need to do with that. So, moving on to history. So, until the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was no clear definition of what defines being transgender. The term literally did not exist. The term and definition literally did not exist until the late 1800s. And we'll actually get into the definition a little bit later, but because history is a thing. But early scientists in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they defined being transgender or gender nonconforming as being mentally ill. And that's a concept that, depending on the culture, pervaded all through the time period of the SCA. So there's few to no notes or documents stating the reasons why someone may have lived as the opposite gender or as an iteration of a non-binary gender presentation during the period that the SCA covers. For the purposes of the class and also for research that I do, I consider the time period of the SCA anything before 1650 Common Era. Various cultures have got different gender expressions, and they may have just accepted people as they are. There's certainly references as we go through various cultures and time periods where we see that. Modern history, of course, is often going to be viewed through the lenses of Christianity and colonialism. So it sometimes makes it difficult to decipher the intent of those who lived in that period, in that culture, especially if those cultures were outside the spectrum of where Christianity came in, and all the colonial, all of the folks from Europe, for lack of a better term, came in and said, nope, we're taking over and we're doing our thing. You see that a lot in the Middle Eastern cultures and the African cultures as well. So anywhere where the victors came in and said, nope, we're erasing this history. This is what you've got. So we're going to start back in 1460 before Common Era. So 2,500 years ago, or somewhere there about. I can do math. 3,500, nearly 3,500 years ago. I can do math today. We're going to start with Hatshepsut. So when Hatshepsut became pharaoh, they took on a masculine role. They became pharaoh when their husband, which is their stepbrother, died. They basically acted as regent and then were then named pharaoh because their son was too young to reign. So while Hatshepsut, there's some notable things about Hatshepsut, not just with the identity of having that masculine role, but also the fact that so icons were created depicting the pharaoh as male with a full fake gold beard. They were later defaced by not the son, but the pharaoh after they died. But also too, when Hatshepsut went out, they often wore a detachable beard and male regalia. So they wore a detachable beard and male regalia when they went out and about. And then they were the first pharaoh to name themselves as semi-divine while alive. I actually just finished a thing in one of my classes in the mundane world about Nefertiti and the Akhenaten and that whole family line, which Hatshepsut is their progeny of Hatshepsut, or specifically Akhenaten was. So that whole family line caused a lot of different changes for Egypt, beginning with Hatshepsut, and changed the face of how Egypt was regarded. The other notable thing about Hatshepsut, aside from this, is that they were one of the first pharaohs to really invest, or they were one of the first two pharaohs to really invest in the culture of Egypt. So the culture, the art, the architecture, that all started to flourish under Hatshepsut. Bless you. And that was one of the things that developed under them. So more than likely, the identification as pharaoh and as that masculine role it was likely done for political reasons. There's a quotation from one of the articles that I used for research that says, Hatshepsut also took a new name, Mat-Kare. Sometimes translated as truth, Mat is the soul, Ka, of the sun god, Re. The key word here is Mat. the ancient Egyptian expression for order and justice as established by the gods. Maintaining and perpetuating Ma'at to ensure the prosperity and stability of the country required a legitimate pharaoh who could speak, as only pharaohs could, directly with the gods. By calling herself Ma'at Kare, Hatshepsut was likely reassuring her people that they had a legitimate ruler on the throne. Remember again, Hatshepsut took over for her stepbrother, husband who died, and ancient Egypt was super political, probably even more so than ancient Rome, and there was a whole lot of politics in ancient Rome. so that there's again too, because of the fact that we weren't there. I can't go. I don't have the TARDIS. I don't have a time machine. I can't go back and ask Hatshepsut. So, your Grace, I really would like to know like what's going on. Like I want to know what's going on with, I can't do that. So we have all we have right now is just what's left of history and what's been discovered by archaeologists. So we're going to move forward about 1,000 years to 450 before Common Era, and this is the furthest back we have so far documented for the Torah and the Jewish religion. So within the context of that religion, they denote 6 genders. This first one is going to be Zahar. The term is going to be derived from the word for a pointy sword and often refers to a phallus. It's usually going to be translated as male into English. Male. Next, you have Nakiva. This term is derived from the word for a crevice and probably refers to a vaginal opening. It's usually going to be translated commonly, modernly rather, as female in English. Androgynos, we have from the Greek. It's going to be a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. So at this point, it's going to start being notable how many references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are going to be your 1st through 8th centuries Common Era law books, and then the classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So which are documented as being 2nd to 16th centuries Common Era, which are just tacked on as additional clarification to the Torah. For that particular term, there are 149 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then 350 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes of individuals who are androgynous. Next, you have Tumtum, which is going to be a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. So this is going to be someone who is, who is non-binary or genderqueer. So there are 181 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, 335 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. Next, you have Alonit, which is a person who is identified as female at birth, but develops male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. There are 80 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then 40 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. And the final term is you have Saris. That's a person who is identified as male at birth, but develops female characteristics at puberty and or is lacking a penis. A Saris can be naturally Saris, so Saris Hama, or become one through human intervention, which is Saris Adam. There are 156 references in the Mishnah and the Talmud, 379 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So those last 2 terms, Aloni is going to be your modern equivalent of somebody who is transmasculine, or FTM. And then Saris is going to be someone who is the modern equivalent of being transfeminine or trans woman. So, I mean, this is going back to 450 before Common Era. So at this point, we're talking 2,500 years of documentation saying, hi, these people exist. So this is not a new concept. It's just new terms, just like a lot of different things. The world keeps turning. So you're going to bump up another 50 years to 400 before Common Era in the Hijra community in India. So the Hijra are first mentioned in the Kama Sutra, which was written as early as 400 before Common Era. The Kama Sutra is a religious text. I know a lot of people, especially modernly, associate it mostly with a guide to interesting positions to simulate and stimulate themselves with a partner, to put it nicely. But it's ultimately a religious text, and there are other components in addition to that very small section, all things considered. Again, from a different article that I used for research, the Hijra can be eunuchs, intersex, or transgender, and they've been part of South Asia's culture for thousands of years. Even though there was no documentation, they still existed. Eunuchs are celebrated in sacred Hindu texts such as the Mahabharata and the Kama Sutra. And then they also enjoyed influential positions in the Mughal courts. So very firmly within the time period of the SCA, we've got people who identify as Hijra, who, and a lot of the other thing too with the Hijra community is a lot of times they may not necessarily be trans women or trans feminine. They might be third gender. It really depends on, again, that person's identity and how they identify themselves. But again, they've existed in documentation since 400 before Common Era. We're kind of starting to see that theme where it's there's documentation in not just your legal documents, but also in your religious text saying, hey, this is a thing. These people are. Give me 1 second and blow my nose because it's bugging me. Because it's spring and evidently I shouldn't have my window open because pollen's a thing. So at this point we're going to bounce over to Common Era. So 203 Common Era, in the height of ancient Rome. We have an empress who is named Elagabalus, or was known as Heliogabalus. There was during their reign, they were very much a fan of worshiping the sun. So that was a thing. So they're a Roman emperor who was born male and then chose to live as female and chose the title of empress during her reign. So contrary to what I said earlier about using the terms from when they were, if you're that continuity where you're going to use the terms, the pronouns for somebody as they identify now versus later, I'm choosing to use it this way, the two different ones, because there's documentation showing that. It was a very decisive, this is what I'm doing, and there was a point where it was this and then this. For modern purposes, if you're telling a story about somebody in, prior to their transition, use their current pronouns. It's out of respect. Things were a little bit different in ancient Rome. So Elagabalus was known to frequently wear cosmetics and dress as female. And then she also solicited physicians who could provide her with surgery to give her female genitalia. So something of note with that, and bear in mind too that this is a working document. I'm still working on finding documentation for a lot of things with this, and I'm also still kind of going region by region by region by region. So there's a lot I haven't covered yet, but there was absolutely historical reference and notations depending on again, things that we've researched, saying that, gender reassignment surgery absolutely happened long time before we even, before it started occurring modernly. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So it is important to note that, just because of the fact that the technology existed even then, just we have better science and we have better infection control at this point. So there's that. So moving up about 350 years to 567 Common Era, you have St. Anastasia the Patrician. So St. Anastasia the Patrician, long story short, she was a female who lived part of their life and was accorded burial rights as a male monk in seclusion from most people. So here's a skinny on that. St. Anastasia was betrothed to someone that was high up in the French court who was really abusive and kind of a jerk, but was also super interested in religion, was really, really interested in religion, and believed a lot of the things that the Bible said and wanted to follow, the path of Christianity and do all the research and whatnot. So what she did is she went to her local abbey and said, Father Abbot, I have this problem. I really don't want to get married to this guy. He's a jagoff. He's abusive, and this is not going to work for my life. I don't think I can be a good Christian in the context of this, and the father basically said, here's what I can do for you, my child. I have this spot up here in this cave. We can put a bed up there for you, and I can have a brother that I trust with my life come up here, and they will bring you food and water as necessary, and they will bring you reading material so that you can study. This is notable for a few reasons. One, because it's somebody who, betrothal and all of that nonsense, family ties, were super, super, super important at that point. I mean, they continue to be through most of the time periods that we all study in the SCA, but there's this whole we're breaking this betrothal to do a thing. And really, if you were studying religion, that was really or you were intending to live a pious life, that was the only real way that you could break out of that. Because otherwise there were expectations of the family. The other notable thing about this too is that in terms of Anastasia being canonized, it happened very, very quickly. Normally canonization, it would be several hundred years. There would have to be proof of a miracle. There would have to be all these other things that were accorded by the Roman Catholic Church. But as I've been doing research, basically the abbot must have been really good in with the Pope and told the Pope this, here's the deal. I've got this person. They have given up every worldly possession that they have. They've given up their identity even. No one except for me and this other brother know who they are. They've given up everything. And this is really an example of what it means to be pious. And so, the Pope at the time is like, yeah, okay, in this, few months versus a few hundred years. It happened very, very rapidly in the grand scheme of things. So that was one of the other things too, that it was a thing that happened. And to my understanding, it was the same Father Abbot throughout this entire time, just kind of young, maybe a little progressive probably for their first time. And because from start to finish, same person. So that was a thing. But yeah, they recorded burial rites to the male monk in seclusion for most people, except for one or a handful of people essentially. And even so, that brother probably maybe didn't know that they were in, maybe did not know that Anastasia was female. We have really no way of knowing because a lot of those records have been lost to time. And from, invasions and war and everything, the natural way of things where we lose documentation. So moving up about 800 years, 1322 Common Era. So we're starting to get into a lot more of where we have some of the high art, so to speak, where you're starting to see more of the development of the arts and more progressive attitudes towards a lot of different ideas. 1322, Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, he was a Jewish scholar and poet. He was a religious scholar and poet. He wrote Evan Bohan, which is a poem which discusses transitioning and being genderqueer. If you're following along with the notes, it's going to be Appendix 1, but for the full text. But I'm going to pull out one of the sections from it because it really kind of drives the point home about 1322, where we're starting to have this emergence of information and new ideas. It really drives home the point that this is something that is not normally talked about, but these concepts exist. But again, too, this is also for a Jewish scholar. We've had instances, and it's a common thing, since 450 before Common Era. Sorry, further back than that, but even the before Common Era, thousands of years, where we've had the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Jewish law code saying no, this is a thing. So the section is, Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water. You changed the fire of Chaldee so it would not burn hot. You changed Dinah in the womb of her mother to a girl. You changed the staff to a snake before 1,000,000 eyes. You changed hand to white, and the sea to dry land. In the desert you turned rock to water, hard flint to a fountain. Who would then turn me from a man to a woman? Were I only to have merited this, being so graced by your goodness. The entire poem, if you get the opportunity to read it, like I said, my notes are available on my website. I make them freely available because education's awesome. But this entire poem is, it starts off talking about this person. We're saying, wouldn't awful fate for my mother that she bore a son. This person identifies as male, and they very desperately want to identify as female. They have the concept of being the good wife, providing comfort for their husband, providing food for their household, providing, bearing children, bringing them up, bring them up in the realm of being a good Jewish housewife, and just doing all of these things to support the family and support the home life, versus having all of these different, being conscripted to the military, or no, you're going to be, or no, you're going to do the, you're going to run the business instead of being, the home body. So it's, you start seeing in the later period, in the later part of the period that we study, you start seeing the emergence of all of these different ideals that start almost breaking away from the patriarchy, basically, like this very male-driven, the man is the ruler of the household and has to be this strong, this strong masculine presence. And you start seeing these documents that start questioning all of that, and start also promoting the idea that feminism is a positive thing. We'll get to that in a moment. So in another part of the world, in Italy, you've got Rolandina Roncaglia. So this is going to be in Italy. She was a prostitute who identified as a woman. She was born male and had very feminine features. From one of the articles I read that was tied to legal documents at the time, because at this point we're documenting everything, like all of the legal proceedings that are going on in a particular country or whatnot, they're being documented at this point. And at this point, we're also not having these huge uprisings where we're destroying a lot of documentation for that. But from that document, and he continually frequented the prostitutes of Rialto in bed, and going to the public baths with them. And meanwhile, he hid his member on both sides, so that no one ever noticed, and that they all very clearly considered him a female. Rolandina was prosecuted as a prostitute by the Lord Doge in Venice and condemned to be burned. So even when she faced death, she did not recant her statement of identity. Which, I mean, it tracks out very much with the concept of identity that we have now. This is who I am. This is who I am, even in death, even with being offered the opportunity to repent. This person's still saying, nope, this is me, deal with it, and was ultimately, I mean, Rolandina was ultimately, she was ultimately executed for her crimes, because at this point we're starting to see the rise of the Inquisition and the very heavy persecution of anyone who is not straight and Christian. So we're seeing a law that starts to roll through Europe, not just in Italy, but Italy and Spain were very heavily influenced by this as well, and to some degree, England as well. So about 11 years later, we've got Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan is known for a multitude of things. She was a Venetian who was a poet and an author of that was a at the court of King Charles VI of France. So she was one. So King Charles VI was her patron. Again, this is during the Inquisition. So in Italy, having so radical thoughts that basically defied the concept of the natural order of things, where the Bible is the soul defining thing. We have Christine de Pizan. So she wrote the Book of Three Virtues in 1405. That book theorized that souls have no gender, but they inhabit masculine or feminine forms based on the will of God. So within that book, she also argued that the souls of masculine and feminine individuals are created in God's image and are equal to one another in all things. Again, one of the say what we will about France, they're very progressive for the time period and still continue to be in terms of the law. They, France was one of those cultures, that was one of the cultures in one of those kingdoms or one of those countries where it's, not only are they promoting the concept of just, we want to good food, good wine, good cheese, good bread, good life, but in the pursuit of those things, they're encouraging, hey, maybe this isn't necessarily how it needs to be. Maybe there's something else. Let's talk about that. Let's think about it. So you have a lot of, especially towards later period, you have a lot of these. First with the iPhone, can you mute for a moment? Or actually, give me a second. I will take care of that problem myself. Okay. So you have the concept of that where, you basically have these think tanks, especially in this court. And it kind of changes, like, depending on the culture, depending on the country and the time period. But generally speaking, France is this bastion of, we want to pursue all of the knowledge. So one of the other theories that was mentioned in this, which was super radical for the time, because again, we're in the middle of the Inquisition, and fire, brimstone, hell, heaven, all of this is going on. She theorized that a person's gender can change by will of the spirit in accordance with the will of God. Specifically from this book, she said the composition of one's body is arranged so as to reflect the gendered form in conformity with one's gendered offices. If the duties change, the essence has to change, which means that the constituents have to be arranged. That's a lot. It's commonly referenced to be referring to gender transition. If if you were somebody who was going to pursue, if somebody, were going to pursue going into the military, and that is what you were driven to do, maybe identifying as male probably isn't going to be the worst thing you can do with your life. I mean, we end up seeing that later in world history too, but of course, a lot of those instances that we're finding are going to be from the Civil War, which is, of course, out of the context of the society. There's a whole lot more research outside of it than in it. I've chosen a weird niche because it's me and I like the challenge of research. But anyways, so roughly the same time period, 30 years later, you've got John Reichner, who is called Eleanor. So she called herself Eleanor. This is going to be in England. She called herself Eleanor when called into court for prostitution, maintained that identity. She may or may not have been charged for the crime as a way of not acknowledging her gender identity. It's that whole concept that we even see today, where it is, if I don't acknowledge it, it doesn't exist. And just a way of not acknowledging presence. It's not necessarily, obviously in modern society, it's not acceptable. It's certainly not socially acceptable now. But at that time period, it was, if I don't pay attention to it, do not pay attention to the man behind the green curtain. Eleanor also worked as a seamstress for 5 weeks prior to the Feast of St. Michael's, which is a huge thing in England, because St. Michael. One of the biggest things to note about this too is that she was very readily accepted by her community. You know, she worked as a seamstress. You can't, like, so, I mean, you basically had a cadre of women who's like, no, you're my sister. I'm going to help you out. I'm going to give you makeup. I'm going to give you dresses. I'm going to give you the training so that you can establish your new identity and you can establish your role. Because, okay, this is a thing. This is a thing you're going to do. I'm going to help you out. And we even see that modernly too, where you see a lot of the where you see a lot of people that are like, here, let me help you out. Like, either I've got clothing, I've got, you know, I've got makeup, I've got, you know, it's in the SCA, hey, I've got garb that'll fit you. Like, it doesn't fit me, or hey, I've got gold key that'll fit you. Let's help you out so that you're a lot more comfortable with yourself, and just reinforcing that concept of self-identity. And then jumping across the big blue ocean in 1629, which is kind of at the cusp of this, at the cusp of where we study in the SCA. In 1629, you've got Thomasine Hall. So she lived in colonial Virginia. She was possibly intersexed. From a legal document from that time period, she testified that he was both a man and a woman. I'm still doing, like, this is something that I've just literally found in the last 6 months. There's a publication that came out late in 2019 that I have referenced in my my works cited, where I haven't gotten a chance to go through all of the articles yet, but this is one of the ones I was able to go through. Is it basically documented Thomasine Hall. So I'm still doing more research on them and how they identified and if there's other corroborating documents. But I mean, these are all it's a scholarly article, so there's a lot of research done to it. I'm still leapfrogging and finding all those other resources to ping pong off of. So other things in relation to the context of the class, in historical context anyways. So the use of cis in reference to gender. This is the only time during the class I actually mention the term, because as we've discussed, language evolves and it changes. And traditionally, it at least modernly, it has had a negative context within the last decade. And I think it's important to mention that because, like I mentioned, language is a living thing. And like I said, it's important to note that and to recognize the validity of it. So that said, it originated in the 1880s as a way to describe chemical bonds, and then it was adopted by the LGBT community as a way to describe non-trans individuals in 1994. Again, noting language evolves and changes. Prior to the late 1800s, we didn't have any sort of terminology. This is really like at the during the Industrial Revolution, where we're having that second resurgence of science, and we're doing more research with organic chemistry, and we have all the theorems, and we have all of the, we're starting to develop more technology, and all of the scientific methods and everything. We have that baseline, but that's really when inorganic and organic chemistry really kind of took off. And so you had to create terminology to fit with it. It was not originally intended as a pejorative term that more modernly it's been used as. It's like I've seen a shift in the last 5 to 6 years though too, where 2014 to about 2016, it was used a lot of ways as a pejorative term, and it's been almost reclaimed and been redefined as really it's just a descriptor like it originally was intended to be. And there's been a real big push by the trans and gender non-conforming community to redefine that and say no. We're just saying the person is non-trans. That's it. It's not negative. It's just we're trying to restructure the language and make it more inclusive. That's all we're doing. Gender identity and sexual orientation is also a thing too. They're not mutually exclusive. So one's attraction to another is independent of their gender identity, which I mentioned it too. I probably should put it at the beginning, but it goes here because it's just kind of one of those random other snippets. The terms may change if a person transitions and their attractions remain the same. For example, a person who identifies initially as a straight male prior to transitioning will identify as a lesbian when their gender identity transitions to female. They're, like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. So there's some language that adjusts and shifts for that person's identity. Like gender identity, obviously sexual orientation is on a spectrum. That's been a little bit more widely accepted and acknowledged than gender identity, it seems. Awesome. Somebody mentioned that shout out to Julia Serrano for doing a lot of the work on reclaiming the word cis. I will have to research that just because research is a thing. I'm not familiar with that name. So, yeah, that's something I'll have to do a little bit more research for so I can corroborate that and probably get it added because I like having documentation for things. But like I mentioned too, sexual orientation can and does shift for some people as they become more self-realized and become more confident. One of the things about the whole transition process is that it's a lifelong thing, and we're constantly evolving. As people, just in general too, we're constantly evolving. We're constantly changing. Our ideals are shifting. Our ideas are shifting as well, and we basically adjust to accommodate that. That said, I got nothing else. If folks have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you want, or feel free to type. Or feel free to type them into the chat. I have no problem answering from there as well. Yeah. Okay. So to reply to the person, they said, read The Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. Take it with a grain of salt, but she's super important. Okay. That's a starting point for me to go look and do more research. So I'm down for that. Are there any more questions? No. Okay.
Hey. I was just wondering, like, I really appreciated the extra historical points for gender nonconforming, possibly or definitely individuals. I hadn't heard of most of them, and I like to keep an ear out for instances because it's fascinating and it's nice to have some sort of historical context instead of being like, hey, I'm part of a group that didn't exist until 1940 or something.
Right.
But I wonder, because I got into this huge row with a like religious youth group in my undergrad over whether or not trans people should be able to use washrooms, and ended up having this strange conversation with someone who was studying religion. And one thing I got was about, I think it was Thomas Aquinas and natural law as a basis. The whole teleological, like, you are this and therefore God made you to be this and do this. Right. And I wonder if that contextualizes a lot of shift from those earlier period, like before Thomas Aquinas kind of trying to put a religious scientific thing on gender roles. I don't know whether that's useful in the slightest.
I mean, it kind of is. Like, usually if I decide to engage, because I have other things where I like I said, I'm a landed baron, so I have that level of responsibility to my barony. But then also, like, I've got some other stuff in my mundane life where I just don't have the energy right now to argue with people. But to answer your question though, like, if they're starting to argue with me about that, I'm like, no. Christine DePazan was straight up a Christian theologist. She was a Christian theologist.
No.
So, no. and because of the fact that we do have the book that she wrote in 1405, I can go, no, you have multiple instances. Like, you have this instance of somebody who is a Christian theologist saying that this is something that God is saying that it's legit. Like, and it's not referenced just in one section of this paper. It's referenced in multiple sections of it. It's a consistent theme. It's not just going to be the concept of, it's a very strong feminist document, which is really cool to begin with too, because I mean, that also was that was also kind of a newer concept too, of the intelligent female and the intelligent woman, and having somebody who could stand toe to toe with all of these men in the court of King Charles VI and go, no. Let me explain to you what this is saying. This is my theory, and here are all the things that I have as supporting documents to back it up. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, there's historical context. There's absolutely historical context, not just from Christian theology, but also, like I said, from Jewish theology as well, to support saying that, someone who is trans or gender nonconforming, they're absolutely valid in the eyes of, the Creator, however you choose to define that.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I have this concept, however accurate or inaccurate it might be, that there was a point where in a lot of world cultures, it was more acceptable to be gender nonconforming, like the early documentation you gave, like in the early Talmud. And then there was a point when it was not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And I continue to pick at what may have changed that dominant culture. And
honestly, it's gonna be your colonialism. When you had this bearing in mind that I am still I'm at the tip of the iceberg in terms of research, because there's a ton of information out there. I'm still very slowly going through it. The notes I have, and this class is basically, it's a living thing. I'm intending eventually, once I get enough documentation in place, I'm in the process of writing a complete anachronist. So my notes are literally the beginning of my outline for that. And I'm still going through, for those who are not familiar with complete anachronists, they are a series of books. They're very, very thin books, like this thin, but they're anywhere from 30 to, hundreds of pages, 30 to about 100 pages, half sheet sized, but they're just a font of information. There's actually one about Christine de Pizan that I actually bought a couple months ago, because I'm like, hey, there's somebody that I reference in my lecture, and I want to make sure I'm having additional information, like as many references as I can cross-reference with, especially if they're from SCA folks. I like doing that because, give a nod to the people who have done the research. But like right now, my research really focuses on Europe. I'm slowly starting to go through all of the different continents, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of African cultures that absolutely embrace those individuals who are gender nonconforming. Over in the Americas, over in South America as well, you have all the different native tribes that, depending on the culture, they had variations of gender nonconforming individuals. But I don't want to just spout off what's common knowledge. I actually want to have the documentation that says, this is what this was. These are the roles these people had. Even with referencing the Hijra, there's a whole lexicon of that knowledge that I'm just barely scratching the surface on, just to add and corroborate and say, no, like this is how far back all of this goes. And you don't really start seeing this really until you start seeing, you don't really start seeing the discovery, so to speak, until you start seeing the Silk Road, until you start seeing the development of all the different trade routes, not just the Silk Road, but until you start seeing these, basically the cross-pollination of cultures, you're not seeing the discovery of them, even though they've existed for millennia.
Thank you.
Anything else from anyone in the crowd? No? Oh, okay, hold on. So someone also mentioned, I think that Giak's hunch that and I apologize if I just butchered your name, I'm trying. Traditions around the world that accepted non-gender conforming people changed with the advent of colonialism, specifically Christian colonialism, was correct. It seems to be a Western colonial Christian concept that there are only two genders. Yep, pretty much. So like in terms of SCA, like persona research, I study Bruce Viking, which, by the way, I was super geeked to see. Yep, super geeked to see Sophia LaRousse pop on because yay. But I study Bruce Viking, and even like studying looking into the research for how the different Norse groups interpreted gender identity and how they went about things. I mean, like I said, I'm just scratching the surface on a lot of this. So there's information that I know about, but I won't put it in the class until I've got documentation to support it. There's a whole nother thing too with religion, where, I mean, just kind of giving context of the history of the class, the first two iterations of the class, the first iteration of the class I did at Penzic 2 years ago, it included the reference to Loki, but because in the sagas, Loki is the trickster, is one of the various trickster gods that's out there in the world, but they shift gender. Like, they shift gender all the time. Like, gender is just kind of a whatever I feel. So they're a really good example of being genderqueer or being non-binary, because I mean, Loki's got a definite, like, this is what I prefer to be, this is how I prefer to identify, but I'm equally comfortable over here too, and just kind of bounces all around, like, depending on how they identify, how they want to identify for a situation. It's not perfect, obviously, but again, though, until I can provide more context and provide more reference to that, that's one of those things that I'm choosing not to dive further into. Like, I want to get the base stuff down first with documenting a bunch of the different cultures and all of the real world instances, so to speak, versus lore. But lore is something that, especially as I get closer to writing the complete anachronist, that'll be included, because it's absolutely relevant. Lore and religion and all the traditions of a people, they're just as important to identity and really setting that tone for cultural acceptance. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have one. Sorry.
Go for it.
I have been silent for a while.
That's all right.
So I'm Tenoch. I'm from Amsterdam.
Hello.
Yeah, hey. And so, kind of going back to something you talked about in the beginning that I didn't think was appropriate to ask then. So you were talking about like medical situations, where that's really the only appropriate context to ask about certain things when it comes to like birth, gender, and what have you. And this is going to be very poorly formulated because I think it's more of like a topic of discussion.
Okay.
But how would we go about addressing that in the context of like first aid within the SCA?
I'm sorry. I missed the part.
How would we go about addressing that in the context of first aid?
So first aid. So typically, we don't do a whole lot of first aid in the SCA. We no longer have the chirurgeons. Ultimately, my hope is that we don't get to that point. Call 911, do that, because ultimately they're the first aid that we should be providing is, can I hand you here's a Band-Aid, that's where they are, and go sit under the shade and grab some water. That's really the extent of the first aid that we do. Most of my context, obviously, I'm a fighter. I'm a crossover fighter. I do a little bit of everything. Heat stroke is a thing. Sun exposure is a thing. Go sit in the shade. Sit down there. If you get worse, then we're calling the ambulance. My mundane job, I'm a 911 dispatcher, so my first instinct, so really, like, unless you are, it's not something that you yourself are going to be, that you as a layperson are probably not going to be dealing with. It's something that the responders are going to be dealing with. And ideally, let's say that, because I'm going to use myself as an example. Let's say that I pass out in the field. Like, I'm being an idiot. I pass out in the field because it's way too hot and I'm way too humid and I overheat. Obviously, like in real life context, I know myself, I know my limits. I have limits about when I get in armor. But, for glory, for honor and for glory, I go out there, I'm fighting all day, and my adrenaline's up, and I realize, oh crap, I go down. So you're getting my armor off. Well, I don't bind when I fight. So at that point, like, because there's armor, there's stuff coming off, that might be a thing where it might come up, but that's also going to be a life safety thing where, in theory, you have already at that point gotten an ambulance on the way to administer further care. And also too, like, and this is totally not it's totally not an ad, but totally is an ad. If you are out doing any sort of exertive activity in the sun, get a medical bracelet or get some sort of jewelry. This is also me kind of saying this too as somebody who is in the lifeline of being a first responder. If you're a fighter, if you do archery, if you do thrown weapons, if you do equestrian, get something that has identifying information for you. Because with that, you can also put in there those notes, and the first responders can handle that. As far as the context of the SCA, for the first aid that we render, because like I said, it mostly is, can I offer you a glass of water? Or I'm going to tell you to go sit in the shade and pop your top. You're not really going to encounter that. Unless, again, you're a medical professional who happens to be on scene. That's a whole, because I know there's, we have a very wide array of people who live and work in the SCA. Several of my friends are nurses. So, between them and me, like, we might be the first on scene to render care. And, that's one of the questions that I'm going to ask, that person, is there anything I need to be aware of before I start, aside from asking for consent, can I render care? And then also, is there anything I need to know about to basically so I can respect you? And that's going to be, and that's just the standard progression of asking those questions for rendering care. And, but TLDR, don't cause paperwork for your seneschal. Don't, be aware of yourself. But ideally you have a point of contact. If you don't have a medical bracelet or medical jewelry, hopefully you've got somebody at that event that knows you, or that you're at least kind of friendly with, like, even if it's just like Facebook affiliation. Like if you're friends with me on Facebook, that I'm very blunt about everything related to my transition. Like the frustrations I have with looking for top surgeons, and the struggles and the balances, and like some of the other stuff that's impacting that too. And it's a lot of people. Pretty much, the medical exception is really just what I was saying. Don't ask those questions. None of your business unless you're planning on having a good time with me later. So, I mean, really, yeah, that's really the TLDR. Don't ask these questions, because they're really not relevant in the context of the things that we do. Does that answer that question a little bit better? Maybe.
Yeah.
I kind of took the long way around on it.
No, that's fine. I guess, yeah, that was my question, was like the extent of that. Because I mean, I understand that. I used to work medical shelters, so
Okay.
I understand that, like, there's really very little reason to ever cross that threshold, like very little reason to ever cross that threshold.
Right.
But I guess I was wondering, like, especially when you're in the middle of a field and like you are half an hour to an hour away from the nearest town.
Right.
And there needs to be like some immediate emergency aid. Like,
yeah.
what happens there?
I mean, really, if there's some emergency aid, that needs to be rendered, and there is, if there's like a nurse or a doctor on site, there's a whole lot of other legal stuff that I'm not going to get into. But for the lay person, it's really not going to impact them much. It's more of going to be okay, I'm getting, it kind of, I guess it kind of depends on the situation. It really depends on the situation. Like, I can see some medical emergencies where, like, let's say somebody stops breathing, and you've got to do CPR and apply an AED. Quite frankly, my first thought's not going to be whether this person's male, female, or otherwise identified. My thought is going to be, how can I best save this person? How am I going to save my populace member? That's what my concern is going to be. I will worry about all the other stuff. Yeah, I can mitigate everything else later. My first response at that point is what am I going to do? What am I going to do to cause the least amount of damage and ensure this person survives? So it's that whole hierarchy of needs and
Absolutely.
priority of care. So
I just wanted to add that in case this does involve a hospital, ensure there is someone who's going to be there to keep them safe, because there have been documented situations where a trans woman who was beaten up, and because hate crimes happen a lot, especially hate
Yeah.
crimes happen a lot, period. And first responders come by, pick up the trans woman, and are like, "It's a guy." Tosses the trans woman back up, and she dies.
Right.
Or like, there are the long history of issues when you're in the hospital and people just misgender you, treat you as garbage, or there have been situations where doctors have just been laughing at someone's genitals, and these are things that people have documented.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so if it ever comes down to that point, make sure they have someone going along who isn't going to be a piece of garbage.
Right. And ultimately, so I admittedly have to go review some of the documentation for stuff again, just because like it's been a little bit since I've reviewed it. Like I try and read Corpora and also my Kingdom laws like at least once a year, and I'm due up for another read of Corpora because a lot of changes have happened. But generally speaking, though, like it's just good practice though to basically have a buddy, have someone that knows you on scene or on site. Sorry, I'm like getting my language mixed up because I worked last night. But have somebody there with you that you know. Like even if I'm going to another kingdom, I still try and make contact with somebody before. And there's other stuff with that too because the whole landed coronet thing. But I try not to just randomly show up to events too much, maybe, because it's usually poor form for me. But generally speaking, if you can reach out to somebody in that group and say, hey, I'm coming up to this event, who's your best person to contact? Like, I'm looking for accommodations, or I don't know the area really well, and I just want to touch base with that person. Like, to your point, like, I try and at least make a touch point with someone, either somebody from my local area that I'm traveling with, or if I've got a friend in that area. I mean, like I went out to, case in point, I went out to Kaid back in January of 2017. I didn't know anyone prior to me going out there. But before I went out there, partially because I wanted to go to one of their archery practices and they've got some different rules versus the Middle Kingdom, I reached out and said, hey, I'm going to be out here. I want to come to this practice. What do I need to do? Or like, who's my point person for this? And we connected, we emailed back and forth. I sent them a photo of myself, like, hey, this is what I look like, just so you know, you're not wondering, like, who the hell is this weird person walking up to my event? Just so I had a touch point, because of the fact that where I was going was like 2 hours away from my family, 2 hours away from my family members. And like I said, I personally have a road ID that I wear on my Fitbit. So I have my documentation on me, and it links to an online profile or whatever. But still, I let my family members know where I was going. Hey, I'm going to go to an archery practice over here. And then also too, I made contact with that person in advance and said, hey, I don't know anyone in the area because I'm just visiting for the weekend. I just need time away from the family to process stuff, and I want to go shoot. So yeah, I mean, that's, just having that advocate, like or having that friendly face is, might make all the difference. And, not just for those who are trans or gender nonconforming, just like anyone, that's just good. It's a good habit to have, is just to have that touch point. So, and it might be the first time that you meet that person in person. It's a thing. I've had plenty of people say, hey, I'm coming out to your event for, or hey, I'm coming out to your practice. Okay, cool. But we're talking online like in the days and weeks leading up to it. And I'm that person's touch point at that point because I'm the first person they're contacting. So yeah. All right. If there are no other questions, I'm going to kill the recording. But I mean, yep, go for it.
That's actually what I was going to ask, so never mind.
Okay, so there was a question from the quote from the audience. What can Shadowlands do to make sure we are as welcoming as possible to the trans community? So my barony is really weird. Literally between me and most of our core officers, half of the officer group is trans or gender nonconforming. Yeah, we've got some crazy awesome representation, not just in terms of varying gender identities, but also to also both my co-baron and I are people of color. So we've got some crazy awesome representation in our barony. And we actually, outside of the SCA and our kingdom issuing various statements of acceptance and basically being a very welcoming environment, we issued basically one of the first things we did when we stepped up is we said we have an active non-discrimination policy for our barony. Don't be a jagoff, otherwise we're going to have a conversation. It's probably not going to go the way you think. But to answer your question though, just be a shadow lane. Be open, be welcoming, be network. Networking is always a good thing. So one of the things that I do is one of the reasons I travel a lot is I have had groups request I've had groups request me to come down and present my class. Mostly because I do have that literally the first half of the class is all about how do you interact with people. And ultimately it comes down to just showing them basic respect. Don't be a douchebag, be polite, and treat others how you want to be treated. And ultimately, you may or may not like that person for whatever reason, does not matter. You still have an obligation to show them at least basic decency. And that's ultimately what everything comes down to. Be polite, be courteous. And, the whole concept of the SCA is that, aside from being, one really awesome backyard party, we embrace the ideals of chivalry, which ultimately are be kind to others, respect their identity, respect their autonomy, and encourage them to be the best version of themselves that they can be. And ultimately, that's what we do. So just be the shadow lane. If they are, if somebody does come to you and they confide in you that, hey, hey, I'm going to start transitioning. I'd like to identify, I'd like to start, say, I'd like to start wearing the clothing of the other gender or somewhere in between. Do we have gold key until I can get to that point? Because do we have gold key that I can use for an event? This is a thing. Or that person may come to you and say, hey, I'm going to start dressing as this identity at this event. Can you or someone from the barony go with me so that I don't, so that I have someone there? Can you be, can you be my Roman buddy? And it's that whole being kind, being friendly, treating others with respect. In terms of the outreach component, I basically tell people, one, I am generally willing to travel. Once we have all the travel restrictions and the safer home orders are lifted, I'm very happy to come and do travel again. I like doing the travel. Not only is it, the class has been beneficial for the different groups that I've presented at. I presented up at Boar's Head and North Shield in December. I've done it. I did it at Middle Kingdom 50 year, which was it was a thing. But I've bounced. Primarily, I bounced around the Middle Kingdom because my work schedule is really weird, and getting time off is kind of weird. But if I know far enough in advance, I will make every attempt to make it happen. And then also, there's two. We're now doing the online classes. That's something where I'm more than happy to, like, if it's a reasonable hour, if it's something that works with, like, a business meeting, we can call in and we can do a conference call, and I have no problem doing that, just because, like, the information is valuable just across the board, not just for the history but also the interactions and everything, and it might be that guidance. I mean, I've also had again, across the known world, I've had people reach out to me and go, hey, what are your thoughts? For Shadowlands, reach out to your Seneschal. The Seneschals all talk. Like, even if you don't think they talk, they talk. Use your network too. Use your network as a Shadowlane. I know there's Shadowlane groups for each kingdom and every region, and there might even be some for known world. I'm not quite sure because I'm not part of that. That's not a role that I've worked in. But there's all these different groups where we have resources, and ultimately, again, though, it just comes down to be the Shadowlane, be friendly, be the friendly face, because one of the things that I got told when I stepped up as landed is you're going to be someone's first Baron. You're going to keep up the communication, as someone else said. Touch base with them, keeping up the communication with someone if they're transitioning on what they want or what they need. Absolutely. If they want those pronouns used just at the canton level at events, exactly. Be the ambassador. You're going to be someone's first experience with the SCA. So, you're going to be someone's first experience with the dream at some point, and it just goes back to that. Like, be kind, be polite. We've all got our idea of what the dream encompasses, and it's going to be individual for each person, but everything just comes back to, like I said, be kind, be courteous, be friendly. Is there anything else?
Sammy, this is Odette.
Hey.
Hey, so way back when in part of the historical lecture, where do you see ultimately what they got Joan of Arc on was cross-dressing, right? So, I mean, that's ultimately what she was executed for.
I would need to go look and see. Again, I'm still, like, tip of the iceberg in terms of research. I'm still, like, so there's that whole bias thing.
I'm not saying anything about Joan of Arc specifically, but like the canon law about cross-dressing, when you were talking about the prostitute who was ultimately executed. I mean, part of, keeping in mind that not just gender identity, but the fact that cross-dressing was actually a law against canon law. I mean, a crime against canon law. Have you looked into that?
I have not looked into that yet. Like I said, it's tip of the iceberg for me still. There's a lot of things I have not done research on yet that I'm still actively researching between school and work and everything else. So specifically with relation to this class, that whole concept of bias that I talked about at the very beginning of the historical context stuff, like, Joan of Arc is someone that I probably would not include.
I'm not talking, like, again.
No. But I understand what you're saying about the canon law. But I'm saying part of the reason why I haven't delved much more deeply into it is because she identified as female the entire time.
Oh, exactly.
Cross-dressing, but I'm saying, hold on a second. So cross-dressing itself is not a sole indicator for the purposes of this class. It's absolutely, the canon law is absolutely relevant for why people are being persecuted. But
All right, the point I was trying to make is you might want to start looking into canon law for things like cross-dressing and stuff like that as other things that were used to further subjugate those people.
Right. Well, I mean, also too, when Joan of Arc was alive, there was also there was also that whole concept of, unless you are straight and Christian, everything else is going to be persecuted. So that was mentioned, I believe, before you popped in the class, because there are other mentions about it earlier in the class, like where people were persecuted for similar reasons.
What popped into my mind, of course, is that's contemporary with Christine Pazan.
Yeah.
Timeline.
Right. Well, no, because that's one of the whole reasons why she was over in France as opposed to being in England. Or I'm sorry, not in England, in Italy, was because that was during the time of the Inquisition, and they were persecuting just about everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I mean, there's, but also too, like, Christine de Pizan, her concepts were radical. They were radical for that time, but because of the fact that it was framed in the construct of Christian theology, it was acceptable.
Ish.
Well, yeah. But I mean, no one, she was a lot safer. She was definitely a lot safer in France than she was in Italy.
Oh, that is true.
So, because, I'm sorry, not Italy. Gosh, I'm getting my European countries all mixed up. But no, like Italy and Spain were hardcore, like, we're going to persecute all the people, because hardcore doing all the things. But no, that's something that I absolutely will look up at some point, because it absolutely does have relevance in the context of things and for the shape of the world at that point. I mean, there's other things too, where you have the formation of actually not the formation, the further development of Muslim cultures as well, and all the various splits of the various sects at that point too, where I just haven't gotten over to that part of the world yet with my research. So, but I mean, there's absolutely stuff from there too where that impacts, where all of those mentalities start impacting everything else in the shape of the world too, because we have a lot more free trade going on with the Silk Road and all, with the advancement of big ships that can actually make those more arduous journeys. So, I mean, yeah, it absolutely impacts the state of the world at that point. Just I haven't gotten there yet. Is there anything else? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. I greatly appreciate it. It's awesome to see such a diverse representation of people and also kingdoms, because yay, it makes me happy. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording. If folks want to unmute and chat a little bit, I'm more, in the context of non-class related, I'm more than happy to answer questions.